I will not waste your time. At 101 years old, I can tell you this with certainty. The body wants to heal. It is built for repair, built for balance, built for survival. What we call disease is often the result of interference, years of small, repeated insults that drown out the quiet intelligence of our own biology. When I was a younger man, I believed health was something doctors gave you. I believed aging meant inevitable decline. But over decades of living, observing, and correcting my own mistakes, I learned something far more powerful. The human body is not fragile by design. It is adaptive. It is self-correcting. It is constantly working behind the scenes through immune surveillance, tissue regeneration, hormonal feedback loops, and cellular repair mechanisms to bring you back to equilibrium. Health is not a miracle. It is homeostasis. The problem is not that the body fails to heal. The problem is that we continuously disrupt the conditions required for healing. We overload the liver. We inflame the bloodstream. We deprive our cells of nutrients. We overstimulate stress hormones. Then we act surprised when repair slows down. I am not telling you that all disease disappears if you change your habits. I am telling you something more disciplined and more honest. When you remove ongoing harm, the body regains capacity. Not magic, capacity. At 101, I am not alive because I defeated biology. I am alive because I finally stopped fighting it. Let me tell you what I mean when I say the body wants to heal. Every second of your life, even as you sit quietly reading or listening, millions of cells are dying and being replaced. The lining of your gut renews itself in days. Your skin regenerates. Your liver can rebuild significant portions of itself after injury. Your immune system patrols like a silent army, identifying damaged cells, neutralizing pathogens, clearing debris. You do not command these processes. They are automatic. They are ancient. They are protective. That is not poetry. That is physiology. When I was in my 40s, I began experiencing persistent fatigue and joint stiffness. I blamed age. I blamed work. I blamed bad luck. But what I was really experiencing was chronic, low-grade inflammation, the slow burn that comes from years of excess sugar, processed fats, too little sleep, and too much stress. Nothing dramatic, nothing headline-worthy, just small daily poisonings. And that word, poison, must be handled carefully. I'm not speaking only of obvious toxins like tobacco smoke or industrial chemicals, though those certainly count. I'm speaking of repeated biological stressors, ultra-processed food, stripped of fiber and micronutrients, excessive alcohol, sedentary living, chronic sleep deprivation, constant psychological stress. These inputs dysregulate the very systems designed to protect us. The liver is one of your primary detoxification organs. It neutralizes metabolic waste, processes alcohol, breaks down medications, and converts fat-soluble toxins into water-soluble compounds that can be excreted. The kidneys filter the blood relentlessly. The lymphatic system drains inflammatory byproducts. These systems function remarkably well until they are overwhelmed. When toxic load exceeds clearance capacity, inflammation rises, insulin signaling weakens, blood vessels stiffen, repair slows. The body is still trying to heal, but it is working in a polluted environment. I learned this the hard way. At 52, my blood pressure was elevated. My waistline had expanded. My energy was unpredictable. I remember sitting in a doctor's office, prescription in hand, and thinking, is this the beginning of decline, or is this feedback? That question changed my life. Instead of asking, what drug will manage this, I began asking, what input created this? That shift from management to removal is what I call the biological reset mindset. I reduced processed food and returned to whole, fiber-rich plants, vegetables, legumes, whole grains, nuts in moderation. I reduced alcohol to near zero. I prioritized sleep as if it were medicine. I walked daily and incorporated short bursts of resistance training to maintain muscle mass. I practiced deliberate stress reduction, not through denial, but through breathing, reflection, and boundary setting. Within months, my blood pressure improved. My inflammatory markers dropped. My energy stabilized. Was I cured of aging? Of course not. Aging continued, but suffering decreased. This is where many people misunderstand the claim. When I say the body wants to heal, I am not promising immortality. I am describing capacity. The immune system recalibrates when chronic stress decreases. Insulin sensitivity improves when excess refined carbohydrates are reduced. Arterial function improves when inflammation falls. Mitochondria, the energy generators of your cells, function more efficiently when oxidative stress is lowered. These are measurable changes. But here is the hierarchy that most people resist. Lifestyle inputs often exert more daily influence over chronic disease progression than genetics alone. Genetics load the gun, environment pulls the trigger. And environment is not only air and water, it is food, movement, stress, sleep, relationships. When we continuously introduce inflammatory stimuli, we force the body into defensive mode. Cortisol remains elevated. Blood sugar remains unstable. Immune signaling becomes dysregulated. Over time, this contributes to metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular disease, and certain degenerative conditions. Remove the stimuli, and defensive intensity can soften. I have lived long enough to observe patterns in my peers. The men who aged with resilience were not necessarily the men with the best genes. They were the men who reduced chronic insult. They ate simply. They moved daily. They slept predictably. They did not allow resentment to fester for decades. They did not flood their bloodstream with excess sugar and alcohol every evening. Their bodies were given room to repair. We must also speak honestly about limits. Not every condition reverses. Advanced structural damage, late-stage neurodegeneration, certain autoimmune disorders. These are complex and not simply erased by dietary correction. But even in those cases, reducing inflammatory load can improve quality of life and slow progression. That distinction matters. Capacity is not the same as guarantee. If you cut your skin, it closes. If you rest a strained muscle, it rebuilds stronger. If you sleep adequately, cognitive clarity returns. These are visible examples of intrinsic repair. Chronic disease is often the result of invisible, repeated micro-injuries, metabolic, inflammatory, hormonal, that accumulate. At 101, I do not see health as a battle against the body. I see it as cooperation with it. When you stop poisoning the system through excess, through neglect, through constant stimulation, you reduce the workload on detoxification pathways. The liver can focus on normal metabolic duties. The kidneys filter without overload. The gut microbiome stabilizes, producing beneficial metabolites that reduce inflammation. Blood vessels regain elasticity. Immune cells regain discrimination. Healing is not a single event. It is the restoration of favorable conditions. That is the promise I stand behind, not fantasy, not miracle cures, but disciplined removal of harm. The body wants to heal. The question is whether we will finally stop interfering long enough to let it. By the time I turned 70, most of the men I had grown up with were managing 2 or 3 chronic conditions: blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, arthritic pain. Some had survived heart procedures, others were quietly shrinking, physically and mentally, under the weight of medications layered upon medications. I do not say this with judgment, I say it with observation. The prevailing model many of us followed was this: wait for breakdown, then manage the breakdown. Adjust numbers, suppress symptoms, continue habits, repeat. But the body does not interpret your habits as habits. It interprets them as signals. When you consistently overconsume refined carbohydrates, you send a signal of energy surplus. Insulin rises repeatedly. Cells become less responsive. Blood glucose remains elevated longer. That is not a moral failure, it is receptor physiology. When you remain sedentary for years, you send a signal that muscle tissue is metabolically unnecessary. The body reduces it. Basal metabolic rate declines. Insulin sensitivity worsens. Again, not punishment, adaptation. The body always adapts to the environment you provide. This is why I call it a biological reset, not a motivational slogan. If harmful inputs persist, adaptation will reflect those inputs. If harmful inputs decrease, adaptation shifts again. In my late 50s, I began studying, not in universities, but through disciplined reading and lived experimentation. I learned about homeostasis, the constant balancing act of temperature, pH, blood glucose, blood pressure. I learned about the liver's phase 1 and phase 2 detoxification pathways, how nutrients like B vitamins and certain amino acids support metabolic processing. I learned about the kidney's filtration gradient and how hydration directly influences clearance. I learned about the gut microbiome's role in modulating inflammation and even influencing mood. None of this was mystical, it was systemic. I changed not only what I ate, but how I lived. I stopped eating late at night, allowing insulin levels to fall and metabolic repair to occur. I maintained lean muscle through resistance work because muscle tissue is a primary site for glucose disposal. I prioritized deep sleep because growth hormone and cellular repair peak during specific sleep cycles. I reduced exposure to unnecessary chemicals in household products and food packaging. Small adjustments. Consistent. The result was not dramatic overnight transformation. It was gradual stabilization. My blood markers improved. My waist circumference decreased. My energy became reliable rather than erratic. Cognitive clarity remained intact well into my 80s. I was not free from aches or illness, but I was free from the cascade. This is the hierarchy I have come to understand. First, Remove chronic inflammatory inputs. Second, restore nutritional sufficiency. Third, rebuild structural resilience, muscle, cardiovascular capacity, metabolic flexibility. Fourth, protect psychological equilibrium. External toxins matter. Tobacco smoke, excessive alcohol, environmental pollutants. These accelerate oxidative stress and inflammatory signaling. But internal toxins matter too. Chronically elevated glucose, excess visceral fat, unmanaged stress hormones. These create biochemical environments hostile to repair. When people hear, "stop poisoning it," they often think of dramatic exposures. Yet daily metabolic overload is often more corrosive over decades than rare acute insults. Consider inflammation. Acute inflammation is protective. It isolates injury, recruits immune cells, initiates healing. Chronic inflammation, however, becomes maladaptive. It damages blood vessels, impairs insulin signaling, and alters immune responsiveness. What sustains chronic inflammation? Persistent poor diet, sleep deprivation, central obesity, unmanaged psychological stress. Remove or reduce these drivers, and inflammatory markers frequently decline. That is not ideology. It is observed physiology. But I must speak carefully here. Not all disease is self-inflicted. Not all conditions are reversible. Genetic mutations, severe autoimmune disorders, traumatic injuries, these require skilled medical care. I have relied on physicians when necessary and respect their expertise. The narrative is not medicine versus lifestyle. It is this: lifestyle sets the baseline terrain upon which medicine operates. If the terrain is chronically inflamed, overloaded, and deprived, medical intervention becomes harder. If the terrain is relatively stable, interventions often succeed more readily. At 85, I experienced a minor cardiac event. It was not catastrophic, but it was instructive. My physicians acted quickly. I followed their guidance. But I also examined the inputs that had crept back into my life. Subtle increases in indulgence, slight reductions in activity. I tightened the system again. Recovery was steady. Healing resumed because interference decreased. You must understand this distinction. The body does not want in the emotional sense. It is programmed to maintain equilibrium. When equilibrium is repeatedly disturbed, compensatory mechanisms activate. Over time, compensation becomes pathology. High blood pressure begins as adaptive constriction. Insulin resistance begins as protective buffering. Fatigue can begin as energy conservation. These are signals. If we suppress signals without addressing inputs, we prolong disturbance. When I reached 90, I made one final commitment: eliminate excess wherever possible. Excess food, excess resentment, excess stimulation, excess inactivity. I simplified. My meals became predictable and nutrient-dense. My movement became non-negotiable but moderate. My social circle became smaller but supportive. I guarded sleep like a resource. I limited exposure to constant news and agitation, which elevates stress hormones in subtle but cumulative ways. I began to see health not as conquest, but as conservation. Now, at 101, I rise with modest stiffness but clear intention. My blood work remains stable. My cognition is intact. I require minimal medication. I am not extraordinary. I am consistent. The body wants to heal because it is designed to correct deviations. Cut back interference, and correction becomes more efficient. Overload the system, and correction slows. You do not have to believe me. Look at wound healing, post-infection recovery, muscle hypertrophy after resistance training. The blueprint is embedded, but you must decide whether you will cooperate with that blueprint or overwhelm it. This is not about perfection. It is about reducing sustained biological insult. Stop poisoning the system through excess sugar, chronic stress, environmental overload, sleep deprivation, and you increase the probability of repair, not certainty, probability. And over decades, probability becomes destiny. That is the quiet secret of a man who has lived past a century. If you remember nothing else from the words of a 101-year-old man, remember this: your body is not your enemy. It is not waiting to betray you. It is not designed for collapse. It is designed for correction. What we call decline is often accumulated interference. The immune system does not stop working because it loses interest. The liver does not weaken because it forgets its function. Cells do not abandon repair without reason. They respond to signals. And for decades, many of us send the wrong ones: excess calories, insufficient nutrients, constant stress, inadequate rest, emotional toxicity we refuse to release. Then we ask why healing slows. I have lived long enough to see that the body will forgive much if you stop adding to the burden. Remove chronic overload and inflammation can decrease. Stabilize blood sugar and energy steadies. Prioritize sleep and cognition sharpens. Move daily and circulation improves. None of this is mystical. It is cooperative biology. I do not promise you immortality. I do not promise reversal of every diagnosis. I promise something more grounded. When you reduce ongoing harm, you restore capacity. And capacity is the foundation of resilience. At 101, I am not alive because I mastered medicine. I am alive because I eventually stopped interfering with the systems that were trying to protect me all along. The body wants to heal. The real question is not whether it can. The real question is whether you will finally give it the conditions to do what it has been programmed to do since the day you were born.